I'm Renee Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. We have a really interesting show. It's Amphibian Week, so we thought we would do something to touch on that.
Yeah, how fitting. We're very blessed to have Dr. Steve Price with us. He's a faculty member here in our Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and he has taken some time out of his busy schedule to share with us really what are amphibians. And, I think it's going to be really eye-opening for a lot of folks. We got a little preview of his presentation, and it looks really cool. So we'll be really appreciative to have Dr. Price on here shortly. We've also got our Tree of the Week. Laurie's got one for us that I think you all will get a big kick out of as well. Pretty cool species. But we'll save that for a little bit later when it comes. But if you're on YouTube, you can hit us up via email at forestry.extension@uky.edu. And if you're on Zoom, you can use the chat function to interact with Dr. Price or Renee and myself. But glad to have everybody with us. Renee, glad to be with you on this kind of soggy day here in Lexington.
Yeah, we just hope that the severe weather doesn't end up coming back like they mentioned, but everybody stay safe out there for sure. But
yeah, no doubt.
So we're going to go ahead and get started. Dr. Price, if you would like to turn your camera on. I've had shows before with you on them. We've done videos but it was really appreciate you being here and live and in person.
Yeah, happy to be here. Excited to talk about amphibians.
Yeah, we're excited. If you want to go ahead and start your presentation, you can go ahead.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks again.
Okay, perfect. Well, like I said, I'm very happy to be here to talk about amphibians today, and I'm going to be focusing mostly on amphibians from Kentucky, but I'll be providing some information about amphibian ecology in general, things like what an amphibian is, a little bit on identification of like some of our most commonly seen amphibians in Kentucky, and then I'll touch upon some management strategies, conservation issues, things like that as they relate to amphibians. So as Renee mentioned, it is Amphibian Week. So Amphibian Week started back in 2020, I believe, and it's generally the first full week in May, and it's a celebration of like all things amphibian, and especially focusing on their roles in ecosystems and food chains, but also how they relate to humans, like culturally. And also just a bunch of cool facts about amphibians. So if you're interested to learn more about Amphibian Week, of course, you can just Google it and find it on multiple different websites. But it's run through this Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, and I provide the link to that website here below, and you can see all the different educational materials and things like that. So, what is an amphibian? I think most of our listeners have a pretty good idea of what an amphibian is. Amphibians are frogs and toads, toad pictured and above, I guess your left. Salamanders are amphibians as well. And there's another group of amphibians that most people are not so familiar with, mostly because they live in tropical environments, and they're called caecilians. So that's this worm-like annulated amphibian, which has kind of little rings on it that you see at the bottom. And most caecilians have very poor eyesight. They're blind. Some lack eyes. They spend almost their entire life burrowing underground, although there are some aquatic species. Things about amphibians that people may not know is there's a lot of different species of amphibians. There's over 8,700 amphibian species known worldwide. That's about 2,000 more than there are mammal species. And the thing with amphibians is we're discovering new species every year. Every year when I teach herpetology, I'll say, oh, we know of 8,600 species. The next year when I look it up, we've grown by 100 or 150. So we're discovering a lot of new amphibian species around the world. So how do you define, how do amphibians work? So many of you have probably heard the word cold-blooded to describe animals like amphibians or reptiles or fish. Scientists like myself use the word ectotherm, and that just means that an amphibian's body temperature is very similar to the environment they're in. So of course their blood isn't always cold. Yes, if it's cold outside or in their water, they're cold. But if it's warm outside or you're sitting in the sun, they can be quite warm. How does this actually look? So you see this little graph here, and basically what we have in green is like the body temperature of an amphibian, okay? What we have in blue is like the water temperature of like a pond or a stream or a wetland. And then what's in brown is the soil temperature, like in a forest, maybe adjacent to a wetland. And you can see from this graph that as an amphibian moves from the pond or is in the pond, its body temperature is very similar to that water temperature in the pond. When it moves onto land, its body temperature is very similar to that soil temperature. And so basically they just track the environmental temperature that they're in. And that's why we call them ectotherms. They're cold-blooded. Another really important feature of amphibians is they rely heavily on moisture. Okay, now, a lot of amphibians live in wetlands and lakes and rivers, but they always have to keep their skin moist. And they need to keep their skin moist because their skin is a very important respiratory or breathing organ for them. All amphibians, even those amphibians with lungs, can absorb oxygen through their skin and respire carbon dioxide. So they can breathe, they can undergo respiration through their skin. Amphibians also drink through their skin too. So an amphibian's thirsty, just needs to find a little puddle to sit down in and it'll absorb that water through their skin. Being an important respiratory organ means that their skin always has to be moist, okay? Another feature seen in most amphibians is what we call a complex life cycle. And that just simply means that most amphibians, they lay their eggs in the water. So pictured here is an egg mass from a salamander attached to a leaf. Now those eggs are underwater there, and eventually those embryos inside the eggs develop into a little baby salamander. Okay, and we call these little baby salamanders or baby frogs larvae. We call baby frogs tadpoles usually, and salamanders larvae. And these animals then live in the pond or the stream or the wetland where they eat various things. Tadpoles generally eat plant material, frog or salamanders generally eat little invertebrates and insects, and they grow in there. Now, this larval period can vary a lot between species. Sometimes it can be short as, 2 weeks, and sometimes it can be as long as 2 or more years, okay? But eventually, these larvae undergo what's called metamorphosis. And at this stage, they start to absorb their gills, which help them breathe underwater. Their mouth parts change. In the case of frogs, their digestive system changes a lot. And then they lose these gills, and they change into a little version of the adult. Okay, this would be like a teenage amphibian here. These guys then move from the wetland, usually onto the land, where they eat and grow, and eventually, usually after a couple of years, turn into the adult. And then the adult eventually will find a wetland again where it will lay eggs. So this is what we call a complex life cycle. So those are 3 attributes that generally, help define amphibians. Now in Kentucky, we have lots of different amphibian species. We're lucky in this state to have one of the higher species richness, or the number of species that we see in the continental US. Okay, we have 20 frog species, and we have 35 different salamander species in Kentucky. And they're found throughout the state in all our different regions. So in the far western part of Kentucky, on this figure shown as the Mississippi embayment, we have things like tupelo and cypress swamps, lots of wetlands. And the amphibians that we find there are those that are more typically associated with like low-lying areas, especially coastal plain areas of like the Carolinas and Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama. And in the far eastern part of the state, which is over here, we have amphibians that are more associated with like the Appalachian Mountains, okay? But of course, all our regions have amphibian species, and it's fun to find amphibian species throughout the state of Kentucky. So let me first talk about some of our salamanders in Kentucky. we have various types of salamanders, kind of broke them down here into the habitats they prefer to be found in, okay? So we have a number of salamander species that are what we call fully aquatic. And they're fully aquatic as larvae and as adults. And you can see from some of these pictures here, like of this mud puppy and of this other one called a siren, they have external gills that they use to breathe underwater. So they get their oxygen from the water, and they always stay in the aquatic environment. We have other ones like this Amphibian, which is the longest salamander in Kentucky, probably gets about 2.5 feet long, a really large one. And then we have another one called the hellbender that actually doesn't have gills, okay, but it breathes entirely through its skin. They're one of the largest salamanders in Kentucky. Here's me holding a hellbender, and you can see that in terms of like its length, but also its weight. It's probably the heaviest salamander we have in Kentucky. So they're truly kind of giants among salamanders. Now, to illustrate how they breathe, this is a really nice picture. You can see that on the hellbender's body, it has all these little wrinkly folds of skin, okay? They kind of look like lasagna noodles or things like that. And all those wrinkly folds of skin increase the surface area of that animal and allow it to absorb oxygen from the water. So it's just taking oxygen from the water, and that's all the air it needs to fully, or all the oxygen it needs to fully function. You can see here on the map that hellbenders are found throughout the state in most of our larger river systems, like the Kentucky River and the Licking River, for example. Hellbenders are also really neat because the males, or the dads, are pretty good parents. So during the fall, the male will find a big rock in a river, kind of create a little den site underneath it. The male will attract females to that. The females will lay their eggs. The males will fertilize the eggs, and the males stay with those eggs when they're developing. They'll guard those eggs from animals like crayfish or fish that want to eat those eggs, and also from other hellbenders, which sometimes another hellbender will come in and raid a nest and eat those eggs. So here's a picture of a male in his den guarding those eggs. Some of our other salamanders are more associated with wetlands. The term wetland that I'm using here is just usually generally a body of water that sometimes dries, especially during the late summer or early fall, that has emergent vegetation, but can also have like trees in it too. And those are special types of wetlands that we call swamps. But these wetlands are usually isolated from like rivers or other larger bodies of water. So we have a number of species that prefer to breed in wetlands. That means they lay their eggs in wetlands. We have things like marbled salamanders, spotted salamanders, tiger salamanders, and Jefferson salamanders. When they lay their eggs in wetland, they all have, the eggs hatch, and they all have a little larval period where they're a little baby salamander with gills there, where they feed in these wetland environments. The newt is also a wetland associated species, the red spotted newt, and it provides a really good example, again, of complex life cycles and just how these animals use the wetlands. So the adult newts are very aquatic. They have a big tail fin here where they can use to swim around the water. They lay their eggs in these wetland environments where the eggs develop and hatch into larvae. And then the newt's a little bit interesting compared to our other salamanders because they have this very defined juvenile or teenage stage called the red aft. And lots of people have probably seen red afts when they're hiking in eastern Kentucky or other areas in Kentucky because they're very conspicuous. They spend a lot of time, in the leaf litter and just kind of walk around. Now, a newt will remain in this red F stage for a number of years, in some places up to 7 years, before it transforms into this aquatic adult, which is in the wetland, and it can repeat this life cycle. Sometimes the wetlands that these newts live in will dry up. So the adults then will transform into this terrestrial adult where they lose their tail fins, their skin changes a little bit, so they can survive like in the forest environments until these wetlands fill up back again with water. And then these terrestrial adults can move back, it can change back into the more aquatic adult stage. So newts are found throughout Kentucky. They're especially common in eastern Kentucky. And the really interesting thing about these red Fs is that they're very brightly colored. And a lot of people would think, oh, it's so brightly colored, a lot of predators can see these animals. But this color serves as a warning for other animals. We call it aposematic coloration. It's just a warning coloration. It says, don't eat me. All amphibians have special glands in their skin called poison glands that can make them distasteful. But sometimes some amphibians in their poison glands can be quite toxic. And a newt, or especially a red aft, is quite toxic. It warns predators not to eat them. And so they don't have too many predators within the environment. And that's why these animals are so bold, and people tend to see them as they're hiking through the forest, because nothing really likes to eat red afts. Spotted salamanders are another example of a wetland-associated species. These are beautiful salamanders found pretty much throughout Kentucky with these bold yellow spots on the back. Sometimes they have orange or yellow spots on the head. They breed during the winter time here in Kentucky. So during January or February, the males and females will move from the forest to the wetlands and lay their eggs. And their eggs are these giant kind of gelatinous clumps, egg masses that feel like a piece of Jello in your hand. And this mass, or this gelatin-like substance surrounding these eggs, serves to protect these eggs from predators that want to eat the salamander eggs. Things like newts like to eat spotted salamander eggs, and it's an extra level of protection. One of my favorite salamanders that breed in wetlands in Kentucky is the tiger salamander. This is our largest salamander in Kentucky that you find on land, okay? And they may get up to about 10 inches long, or maybe a little bit bigger. They have yellow and black markings, kind of like a tiger maybe, but I like to think of them as they get their name because they're voracious predators. All amphibians will eat whatever they can fit in their mouth. And of course, most amphibians are small, so they're eating insects and invertebrates like worms. But a big tiger salamander like this will not only eat worms and crickets, but it will eat small frogs. It'll eat other salamanders. And a really big tiger salamander has been known to eat rodents as well. The final wetland breeding salamander I'll talk about is the marbled salamander. This gets to be about 4.5 inches long, found in eastern Kentucky and most of western Kentucky, with these nice kind of marbled-like coloration on its back here. They're really neat because they move into wetlands to breed when these wetlands are lacking any water. So like in the fall or the early winter. And they'll lay their eggs on land, create a little nest. These are all marbled salamander eggs. And the females will stay with those eggs until we get our fall rains and these wetlands fill back up with water again. And the female will leave and the eggs will hatch. And then these marbled salamanders then grow throughout the winter and spring until they go through metamorphosis, usually in early June here in Kentucky. Now we have another number of salamanders that you find in streams, and they lay their eggs in streams. We have a number of species of kind of brown colored salamanders called dusky salamanders. We have boldly colored long-tailed salamanders. We have species called spring salamanders. And all these animals have an adult stage and a larval stage, which you find in the stream. And you can see both of these larvae pictured here have little external gills that they use to breathe in the water. One of my favorite ones, and one that people regularly encounter, is called the red salamander, especially common in eastern Kentucky. And these guys are boldly colored, bright red, with all these little dark spots on their back. They also have really golden kind of eyes here. And you tend to find them under rocks and logs next to streams. The spring salamander is another species. And this is one of our larger species associated with streams and springs and seeps, especially in eastern Kentucky. It's colored similar to the red salamander, a little more orange or salmon colored. They have big eyes and they have little ridges that kind of run here along the front of the face. Now, spring salamanders are notorious for eating other salamanders. Here's a picture of one that has just eaten a dusky salamander. And so they prowl these streams at night, especially on rainy nights, looking for other salamanders, which then they capture and consume. Probably the most commonly seen stream salamander in Kentucky is a southern two-line salamander, which occurs throughout the state. And sometimes you can even find it in suburban and urban areas as well. The females lay their eggs on the bottom of rocks and streams, and the larvae spend about 2 years in streams before they transform into adults. Now we have one species that's pretty unique to Kentucky, and it's called the streamside salamander. Like our other stream salamanders, they lay their eggs on the bottom of rocks, kind of these gelatinous eggs here, and here's a male and female that just finished laying eggs. They're commonly found in streams that have lots of water running through them in our winter and spring and early summer, but then dry up in midsummer. And then the larvae will hatch from these eggs, let's say in February, and they'll undergo metamorphosis within 80 days of hatching. So they have a very short larval period. The reason the salamander is unique is because it's almost entire global distribution. When we think about the entire distribution of an animal, this is the only place in the world where the streamside salamander is found. About 60 to 65% of its global distribution is found only in Kentucky. And finally, we have other salamanders that have no larvae and live their entire life as adults, usually in forested environments. We have things like green salamanders and zigzag salamanders. Now you might think, how do they not have any larvae? Well, the adults find a place on land that's very moist. They lay their eggs on land. Usually the females guard these eggs, and then the young eventually hatch out as little miniature versions of adults. So this is a baby green salamander shown here on a dime, and here's an adult green salamander. So they skip that larval phase entirely. One of my favorites, and the one people often see in Kentucky forests, is called the slimy salamander. It's a black salamander with white spots. It occurs statewide. Its name is a little misleading, and it'd probably be better called the sticky salamander, because when you pick these guys up, they excrete a very sticky mucus from their skin. And it's almost like a glue-like substance. It serves as a protection for them from predators that want to eat them, but it's very difficult to get off your hands. Usually when I hold a slimy salamander, it takes like a day or two for me to get that glue off my hands. And we have 20 species of frogs in Kentucky. And they're found, again, statewide, various species like spring peepers, leopard frogs, green tree frogs, green frogs. One that people commonly see are American toads. Toads are frogs. So not every frog is a toad, but every toad is a frog. And toads are just characterized by having kind of rough, warty skin, shorter hind limbs than other frogs, and they generally hop instead of leap. Okay, and you can see the warts here on the back of this American toad. Now, oftentimes people hear frogs instead of see them. So I have a few frog calls to play for you guys. So this is the American toad call. And generally people hear this from like late February through June here in Kentucky. It's a high-pitched trill that lasts for about 25 to 30 seconds. Sometimes you hear these frogs calling during the day, but more often you hear them calling at night. It's real fun to go to your local pond and see if you hear any frogs calling. Another species that people often see is the gray tree frog. So these are kind of rough little warty frogs here that oftentimes you see them as gray, but like all our frogs are capable of color change. Sometimes they can be green, sometimes they can be a dark brown. One characteristic that people always look for to be able to determine if it's a gray tree frog is they have bright yellow on the bottom of their legs. Now, these frogs are often seen by people's houses at night, especially if you have a little light by your door that attracts insects. And these frogs will go up there and try to catch these insects. They have kind of a harsh-like call or trill. Next one is the spring peeper, again, a species that occurs throughout the state. And they're one of our earliest calling frogs. So some years they'll start calling as early as January on a warm, rainy nights. And their call is very loud. So you can hear a spring peeper chorus from sometimes over a mile away. It's this high-pitched whistle. And if you have 100 spring peepers calling from a wetland, it's almost deafening when you stand in the middle of their chorus. And the bullfrog is another species that many people are aware of. So they're our largest frog in Kentucky. They're also the largest native frog found in North America. They're what we call true frogs. So they have really big hind limbs, very good, capable jumpers. You can see here, this is the eardrum of the bullfrog. This is the eye. Females generally have smaller eardrums than males. It's a good character to look at. Their sound, some people refer to it as sounding like juggo rum. It's a real kind of deep call. They mostly call during the summer months. So what you've heard are calls made by males attracting females. Okay, so these calls are associated with reproduction. But frogs are capable of making some other calls as well. Bullfrogs and some of our other species are known to make distress calls, and these are calls made that serve that when they're, let's say, when a predator's nearby, and this may serve to a warning to other frogs, but it also might just generate a situation where they make this distress call another animal to the scene, and then kind of create chaos, and then hopefully the frog will get away. Here's a bullfrog distress call. So that frog made that call when it was being swallowed by a water snake. And so it holds its mouth open, makes that call, and then it's hoping for maybe a fox or a raccoon to come by. The water snake gets nervous, lets go of the frog. The frog survives and lives to see another day. So the final one I want to talk about is one of our rarer frogs in Kentucky called the crawfish frog. And the crawfish frog gets its name because it lives most of its life in crayfish burrows. So crayfish often dig those little burrows. People see them next to streams or wetlands or sometimes in fields. Sometimes there's a little dirt mound around those burrows. Well, the crawfish frog lives inside of there. It only leaves those burrows for a few weeks each year, usually in March, where it leaves its burrow, breeds in a wetland, lays its eggs in the wetland, and then it will move all the way back to the crayfish burrow that it lived in. Sometimes they occupy burrows that are a mile away from the wetland that they live in. They have a real deep kind of snoring-like call. So now that I've introduced you to some frogs of Kentucky, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about conservation and management. So amphibians worldwide are one of the most threatened groups of animals. A recent study estimated that over 40% amphibians are threatened. And although there's things like disease that are having big impacts on some amphibians, invasive species can have impacts on some amphibians. Most amphibians have been disappearing and are now considered threatened due to changes in habitat. Okay, so we drain wetlands or we remove other critical habitat features, and then the amphibians disappear. People often ask me why we should care about disappearing amphibians. And there's a couple of important reasons. One is amphibians are very important as predators and prey. So I talked about larval amphibians like larval salamanders here. When they're at this larval stage, they eat all kinds of aquatic invertebrates, especially things like mosquito larvae. And as adults, they move on to land. And on land, they eat all kinds of different invertebrates. So they serve as very important predators of invertebrate populations. And some studies have shown that they regulate invertebrate populations within streams or on forest floors or within wetlands. They're also really important as prey. And here's an example. This is a wetland found in South Carolina where some of my collaborators have done research. It's a decent sized wetland. It's about the size of 6 soccer fields. Sometimes this wetland goes dry, completely dry. Okay. Well, researchers at this site spent 1 year capturing every amphibian that came into this wetland and every larval amphibian that went through metamorphosis and left this wetland. They weighed every amphibian, and they estimated the number of amphibians entering and leaving this wetland was equivalent to 3.1 tons. It's like a car and a half worth of amphibians just leaving a single wetland. So that's a lot of animals leaving this wetland. Why is this important? Well, a lot of things like to eat amphibians. We have birds that like to eat amphibians. We have snakes that like to eat amphibians. A lot of mammals eat amphibians as well. So they play very important roles in the food chain. Amphibians are also used as indicators of water quality. Studies done in eastern Kentucky has shown that as water quality decreases, as shown along this axis here, the number of salamanders, both adults and larvae, tend to decrease as well. So scientists are often using amphibians and the number of amphibians, how many species they are, to indicate things about the environmental conditions. Amphibians are also really important to humans. We can think of many examples like Kermit the Frog, where amphibians are important to our culture. They've also been widely used in medicine. Things like African clawed frogs are like the lab rat of amphibians. And people study things like limb regeneration and other aspects of their reproduction, especially looking at amphibian eggs. We've learned so much about embryonic development from studying the amphibian egg, which is clear, and we can see that embryo develop. Amphibians are also an important food source for many humans around the world. Things like frog legs are readily consumed, an important source of protein. So given the issues with amphibians facing their declining populations, and on top they're important for ecosystems and also important for humans, people have done are very interested in managing for amphibians. So here's a few pointers when we think about amphibians and their management. All amphibians prefer cool, moist environments. So keeping these conditions is really important. So allowing leaf litter, dead trees, logs like woody debris to naturally decompose on the forest floor is important because amphibians live underneath the leaves and under the logs, and they need these cool, moist conditions to survive. Minimizing things like soil disturbance, especially around really important habitats like wetlands, can be really important to manage for amphibians. There's just a picture here of a stream with a lot of logs around it, and this would be a great stream to look for stream-associated amphibians. Outcrops can be really important for amphibians too. A lot of amphibians live in these rock outcrops, and maintaining canopy coverage over these rock outcrops can allow these amphibians to persist. I've talked a lot about wetlands, and I talked about wetlands that kind of dry and during some times of the year and are very wet the other times of the year. These are the most important types of wetlands to amphibians because these wetlands generally lack fish. Fish like to eat amphibian eggs and amphibian larvae, and wetlands that dry up don't have fish. So amphibians do best in these wetlands. But amphibians need the forest around the wetlands as well, okay? Most amphibians, after they undergo metamorphosis, move into the surrounding forest. And it's been shown sometimes over 500 feet away from these wetlands. So protecting some forest around the wetlands can be critically important for these animals as well. They can move sometimes over a quarter or a fourth of a mile away. And sometimes they take off and really move far away from these wetlands. And we call this move called a dispersal. And it's been shown that things like marble salamanders can move, 0.6 miles or even farther away from wetlands when they're dispersing. Scientists have developed a lot of different management strategies when we think about amphibians and how to protect their populations. These are some examples here. If you have a wetland, you want to maintain some kind of habitat around that wetland here at some distance. And in the study, it estimated between 142 and 289 meters to protect adult amphibians that then move back to these wetlands to breed. And we can say the same thing about streams. And I guess the important thing is maintaining some kind of riparian buffer, like we do a lot in Kentucky with streamside management zones, can be critical for allow these amphibians to persist. The final thing I want to talk about is how amphibians kind of exist across larger landscapes. If we consider a series of ponds in a landscape, we have amphibians moving between these ponds, often through dispersal movements, and this allows an overall connectivity within a population. Now, the reason why a lot of amphibians have disappeared or declined is because humans are very good at creating barriers. Okay, so if we have a series of ponds that all amphibians move between and they're all connected, we often put in things like roads that can reduce these connections, housing. Sometimes we introduce fish to ponds, and this can cause an overall kind of isolated situation for amphibian populations, where then they're more susceptible to decline. If you're more interested in habitat management guidelines for amphibians, again, I'm going to talk about the Partners for Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, but they've come up with habitat management guidelines for amphibians. And some of these guidelines focus on multiple types of land use within a site. And you can download these guidelines for free at the website that I've provided below. So again, I want to thank you for the time today. Really happy to talk to you about amphibians, and just a reminder that it's Amphibian Week, so check out some of the materials online. And that is all I have.
That was wonderful. I really loved that. And we do have a couple of questions, but one thing I wanted to ask you, that slimy salamander that you were talking about, you said that would help the predator if it's sticky and it makes it, or does it taste really bad?
It probably tastes bad, but what I've seen in some pictures are things like garter snakes trying to eat them. And so as they're chewing on them, they're getting all this stickiness on their jaws and on their body. And in some cases, they end up the predator ends up kind of gluing itself together and lets go of the salamander because it's just too hard for it to eat. So, yeah.
Man, there is so much out there that many of us overlook or are unaware of. And Dr. Price, you did such a wonderful job really highlighting all of these creatures that are out there and a big part of our forests and wetland areas. I really appreciated also your kind of talks about management. We have a lot of county extension agents that participate in this show, as well as woodland owners. And so talking about that management, what they can do. And I think we need to do a better job of selling this the streamside management zones from that wildlife benefit as well. So that was
those are very important for a lot of the animals that live in streams. So streamside management zones protect the water quality, but they also provide really good habitat for amphibians and other animals. So
no, I think that's great. I think that's a good way to get that kind of installed on the ground more often. Yes. If people realize the wildlife value.
There are a couple questions in the chat pod. I'm trying to scroll up to make sure. Let's see. One is, how will an amphibian adapt to a warming environment?
Well, that's it. That's an interesting and a really big question. So when we think about climate change impacts to amphibians, there's a number of things that we have to consider. One is droughts. And so like if we're experiencing hot weather with more frequent droughts, the water within wetlands and sometimes intermittent streams just won't be as persistent throughout the year. And that could affect amphibians that may have like a longer larval period and need to be in that wetland longer before they can go through metamorphosis. Another thing that, we often think about too is kind of changing precipitation patterns, especially sometimes these really heavy storms that we've been seeing now during the summer months. And what happens, especially for stream amphibians, is it's really difficult for them to persist in streams that are constantly flooding, right? And of course, we can do some land management around these sites to kind of prevent that excess flooding, but there's nothing you can really do about like 100-year flood in eastern Kentucky, right? And so what it's been shown is what happens to amphibians that live in these streams is they get flushed downstream into some, let's say, larger rivers, where then they succumb to predation and other things like that before they can move their way back up into these small streams that they live. We also need to think about just these amphibians, the fact that they like to remain kind of cool and moist. And if we have increasing temperatures, it may push past some of like the physiological thresholds that these animals have. So yeah, it's a big question. There's lots of research involved in that. Yeah.
Well, we'll get you back on and talk about some of that certainly in the future.
Definitely. And there was also a tied to that, and make sure I'm pronouncing this right. It's like, what is the benefit of being ectothermic? Is that right?
Oh, well, it's much more energy efficient than it is to be endothermic like we are, like
Yeah.
mammals and birds, right? We have to eat all the time, right? We have to eat all the time because basically that generates energy to generate heat in our bodies, right?
Mhm.
Amphibians, and reptiles as well, don't have to eat all the time because they're generating the energy they need to heat their bodies from the external environment, right? And so, like, they can just bask out, get to a preferred body temperature, and they're great. So, actually, they're way more efficient than we are as mammal compared to mammals, and
Uh-huh.
that's why something like an amphibian can go a long time without eating. It could one of those spring salamanders could eat a couple dusky salamanders, maybe once a month, and that's it. A bird or a mammal could never survive if it was only eating, once every month.
Uh-huh. Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I like the idea too when you so they just go in and get the water through their skin. I was like, wow, that's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yep. So they just need to sit in a puddle to drink or collect water off of vegetation, and they'll absorb water that way.
They're very interesting. We have
Yes.
several comments about a very interesting show, and they appreciate
Yeah. And some
it.
good feedback from folks. Yeah. It was well received, Dr. Price. Thank you so
Good.
much.
I'm
Happy
sure
to do it.
we had talked about several shows we might do in the
I
future. So
know.
stay tuned, folks.
Well,
If you like this one, we'll have him back on.
well, he's got the whole Price Lab here in our department, and he's got so many graduate students doing such great work. It's yeah, you've got a lot of stories to tell for sure.
Yeah, we could have a whole episode on hellbenders or
I would love that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think everybody would. It's something a lot of people have never seen in person, right? So it would really be cool.
I want to know how they got their name.
Oh, I think it's kind of related to their overall appearance, which some people find disgusting, and
Oh, I
the
see.
idea that they've risen from the depths.
No, that makes sense. That
Yeah.
makes sense. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I greatly appreciate it.
Yes, it was awesome. Good
Yeah, it was
stuff.
awesome.
All right.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Very cool.
So we have one more presentation
Yes.
today, and we are going to have Lori Thomas on it.
I'm Laurie Thomas with the University of Kentucky Department of Forestry and Natural Resources Extension, and I'm here with the tree of the week, the American elm. Ulmus americana, also known as white elm, is a beautiful deciduous tree of the eastern United States. This graceful, well-known species is a member of the Ulmaceae, or elm family, which is made up of 18 to 19 genera and about 150 to 200 species, which are found in the temperate regions of both hemispheres. In Kentucky, we have 5 elm species, with American and slippery elm the most widespread and numerous. A tall, gracefully spreading tree that has a naturally occurring vase-like or urn-like habit or form when growing in an open setting. It was America's favorite shade tree for lawns and streets, especially in the northern cities. When planted along streets, its high, graceful branching created a high tunnel or vaulted effect along the streets. American elm is a rapidly growing tree that typically grows 60 to 80 feet tall and about 2 to 5 feet in diameter. It is considered a long-lived species, often reaching 175 to 200 and even 300 years. Unfortunately, a vascular fungus, Dutch elm disease, has had a tragic impact on American elms. The hundreds of thousands of dead elms in the forests, shelter belts, and urban areas are testimony to the seriousness of this disease. American elm's native range includes most of the eastern United States into parts of the Midwest to North Dakota and into Texas. In Kentucky, it is found across the state. It grows well in soils with a neutral pH that have medium moisture and are well drained, but it is also known to adapt to both wet and dry sites. It is typically considered more of a bottomland species than upland species. Throughout its range, American elm seldom grows in pure stands and is usually found in a mixture with other species. In fact, it's a major component of 4 major forest cover types. American elm is classed as intermediate in shade tolerance among eastern hardwoods. American elm has deciduous, simple leaves, and the leaves are alternately arranged on the twig, as you can see in the photo. The leaves are ovate to oblong in shape and 3 to 5 inches long and between 1 to 3 inches wide. The leaf base is offset or uneven, and the margins are coarsely or doubly serrated, which you can also see in the photo. The upper surface is green, and occasionally it's kind of scabrous or rough, and the underside of the leaf is pale green and downy. Autumn leaf color is a soft yellow. American elm is monoecious, meaning that a tree has both male and female flowers. The male and female flowers are small and inconspicuous, and they're reddish to greenish in color. They're usually in drooping clusters of 3 to 5, and the flowers appear several weeks before leaf out in early spring. The flowers are wind pollinated, and mammals such as squirrels eat the flower buds and flowers, thus reducing the potential seed crop. The fruit is the seed that is surrounded by a flat, rounded, papery wing that's about 3/8 to half an inch across. The papery wing is deeply notched at the top. The fruit ripens shortly after pollination in early spring and is wind disseminated. Seeds may germinate immediately after they drop, or they can remain dormant until the following spring. Trees can begin seed production as early as 15 years, with abundant production not occurring until 40 years, and American elm is a prolific seed producer when mature. Mice, squirrels, possum, ruffed grouse, northern bobwhite, and Hungarian partridge commonly eat the seeds. Small American elms are known to vigorously stump sprout. The bark is ashy gray with flat braided-like ridges. They have diamond-shaped fissures that separate the flat braided ridges. The outer bark is layered with alternating buff-colored and reddish layers, and young trees tend to have a very spongy feeling bark. The wood of American elm is moderately heavy, hard, and stiff. It has an interlocking grain and is difficult to split, which is an advantage for its use as hockey sticks and where bending is needed. It is used principally for furniture, hardwood dimensions, flooring, construction, and mining timbers, and sheet metal work. Some elm goes into veneer for making boxes, crates, and baskets, and a small quantity is used for pulp and paper manufacturing. American elm supports a variety of wildlife. The flowers and seeds provide food for squirrels, mice, possum, ruffed grouse, and northern bobwhite. The leaves also provide food for a variety of lepidopteran larvae, including the eastern comma and question mark, the mourning cloak, the painted lady, and the red-spotted purple butterflies, as well as the Colombian silk moth and the banded tussock moth. The trees are also a good nesting site for a variety of birds. American elm has been severely impacted by Dutch elm disease. It's the most damaging disease of elms and the leading cause of elm mortality, and all species of elm are susceptible to Dutch elm disease. This disease was first described in the Netherlands in 1919, and it spread to the United States in 1930 in a shipment of elm logs from Europe, and has since spread coast to coast. Dutch elm disease is caused by the invasive fungal pathogen Osteostoma nova ulmi, which is spread by both the European bark beetle and our native elm bark beetle when they are feeding on the trees. It can also spread from tree to tree through root grafts. The fungus invades and grows in the xylem, or the water-conducting vessels of infected elms, eventually creating blockages which cause the tree to wilt and die. Sanitation or removal of infected materials can significantly reduce the spread of new infections, and there are preventative chemicals available to protect healthy elm trees from the disease for up to 3 years. Most of these chemicals are injected in the lower stems or upper roots and move upward in the tree, so these treatments aren't effective for root graft infections. And additionally, the treatments are costly, but it might be appropriate for high-valued trees. The national champion American elm as of 2021 is in Baltimore, Maryland. It's 260 inches in circumference, 112 feet tall, with an 84-foot crown spread. The Kentucky champion is in Jackson County, Kentucky, and it's 225 inches in circumference, 110 feet tall, with a 116-foot crown spread. If you'd like to know more about champion trees, check out American Forest Champion Trees or check out the Kentucky Division of Forestry Champion Trees. Now for a few fun facts about American elm. American elm is the state tree of Massachusetts and North Dakota. There are many famous elm trees, but a few of the famous ones include the treaty elm, which was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where William Penn entered into a treaty of peace in 1683 with the native Lenape. The Washington elm, which stood in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was where General George Washington took command of the American Continental Army in 1775. And the survivor tree in Oklahoma City that was located directly across from the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building that was bombed in 1995. And even though the tree was damaged, it bloomed the following year and has been known as the survivor tree since. The scientific genus name Ulmus is the ancient Latin name for elm, and the specific epithet Americana means from America. Thanks for joining me to learn about the American elm, and I hope you get the opportunity to get out into your woodland, a local park, or take a walk in your neighborhood and maybe see the elegant American elm.
Very interesting segment on the American elm. Big thanks to Laurie for putting that together. A lot of
Yes.
history with that species.
Definitely is. I was surprised how much history was, but there's a lot of history with all of our trees if you just look.
Mhm.
'Cause the trees last a long time. I
So they
probably do
bear,
a timeline of history on most of them out there.
yeah, they bear witness to a lot of our stuff over the years for sure.
If only trees could talk.
Yes, no doubt.
Yeah,
Yeah, big thanks to Laurie for putting that together. Yeah.
definitely. A lot of good information today.
Yeah, I'm very pleased. And, having Dr. Price on talking about amphibians and their importance and the diversity of them, as well as is some of the things that we can do as woodland stewards to try to care for them, was really excellent. I have to have him back on again.
Definitely. And you can find all of our episodes within a week or so on fromthewoodstoday.com. We have, Billy, get this. Next week is our 200th episode.
That's awesome. And a
That'll
big,
tell you how many episodes you can binge watch if you
well,
really want to do.
I know, and I think, it's probably a good time to thank our viewers and our podcast listeners, because without you all, we wouldn't be at this point. So thank you.
Yes, we really appreciate you all joining us each and every week.
Yep.
Tell your friends about it because we're doing this show for you.
Yep.
Again, if you have any comments or suggestions, we get questions all the time through our survey that we have listed there, and we actually have a couple of shows that I'm trying to find people for because people have said, hey, what about this?
Yep.
So we had a suggestion last week about wells, and I am trying to find a couple people, and I think I've almost found one, so we're going to have a show on wells that you find on your property. So it's just interesting about the people that some topics that we may never have thought of, but it would be a really good show. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no doubt. And if you've seen something or you're curious about something, there's a good chance others are as well. So please let us know. We have a little survey link on fromthewoodstoday.com that you can complete and, upload a picture if you've seen something in your woods that you're not sure of, or just give us a good show idea. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so we would love, it'd be awesome if we could have 200 folks on our 200th episode.
There you go.
I'm shooting big, but we really appreciate you all joining us today, and we will definitely see you all next week. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
From the woods today.